Content warning. Check the show notes for more information. It's February 12th, 1965, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
When you think Malcolm X, you probably think of black nationalism and the Nation of Islam, or his work fighting systemic racism and police brutality against African Americans. What you probably don't think about is his day trip to Smethwick, the suburb of Birmingham in Britain. But remarkably, today in history in 1965, just 9 days before he was assassinated, that's exactly where Malcolm X was. And yes, he went to the pub.
Yeah, well, before he went to the pub, he walked down Marshall Street, and that's just an ordinary residential road in some ways, but it was also a place where a kind of informal housing segregation was being enforced, and he chose to walk a part of the street alone, despite the warnings that had been given to him, just so that he could face the situation of the town directly. And sure enough, some white residents came out of their homes to yell racist abuse at him. He stopped at one point to inspect a for sale sign. He also saw the coloured people need not apply signs, which obviously appalled him. And then, yes, he went to the pub. He was invited by a man called Avtar Singh Jouhl, who was a prominent anti-racist campaigner. And they went to the pub together, which was the Blue Gates pub, where a so-called colour bar was enforced, basically meaning non-white patrons were restricted to certain rooms or refused service. And of the experience in sum, Malcolm X said, "This is worse than in America."
And the reason that Jouhl had invited Malcolm X to Smethwick in the first place, and it should be said that Malcolm X was in England at the time. He'd been trying to go to France, but he had been refused entry. So it was known that he was in London. He'd already spoken at the London School of Economics at this point, and so Jouhl then invited him to make the trip over to Birmingham, which he did. But the reason that he decided to go was, as he said, because of the similarities that he saw between the situation in the American South and the situation in Smethwick, which doesn't seem to, they don't seem to have that much in common on the surface. But Smethwick was very much in the national spotlight in 1965 because of the previous year's general election, which became extraordinarily hostile and racially charged in a way that I think even at the time was seen as being quite shocking. Smethwick had this large community of mainly Punjabi Indians and also people from the Caribbean. And at the same time, it was in a period of industrial decline. So those tensions were very much in the open, and they were being stoked by the far right as well during that campaign. The most infamous aspect, the one that you may have heard of, were the leaflets and the posters that circulated in the run-up to the election saying, if you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour. That's often blamed on coming from the Conservative Party, but they were actually produced by the neo-Nazi British movement. But the Conservative candidate, who was called Peter Griffiths, refused to condemn the slogan. He said, "I would not condemn anyone who said that. I would say that is how the people see the situation in Smethwick." Basically, he was too chicken to say that he actually supported that sentiment. And so when he finally won, he narrowly beat his Labour rival. He went to Parliament under a cloud of this racial animus. And in fact, when he entered Parliament, Harold Wilson, the new Prime Minister, said that he should serve his term here as a parliamentary leper.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to remember, because now, if you go to Birmingham, it's one of the most racially diverse cities in the UK, so it's hard to remember this. But at this point, this small industrial suburb in the Black Country was known as the most racist town in Britain. The racial tensions were so high that they culminated in Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, which again is one of those landmarks in British politics that everyone knows about. But I'd kind of forgotten that it was given in Birmingham. This really was like the epicenter of racial disharmony. And what it came from was the same kind of howl of pain and confusion you hear now from white people who have grown up in a place that has had a large amount of immigration quickly, that cannot articulate anything other than the community has changed and therefore the solution is discrimination. And you had fears being circulated around that 1964 general election, which were just like viewed now, abject, horrible, racist myths. Black people don't wash. They defecate in their gardens. They bring infectious diseases. They overburden the NHS. Their cooking smells. They're after our white women. But that is the context that white people were voting on at the time. And the feeling was that classic thing of, well, I'm not racist because I didn't have a problem when we had a black family move into the street. The problem is now there's too many of them. I'm okay with one Asian family or one black family, but this is ridiculous. We're being swamped. And of course, you know, for those people that were coming from ex-empire countries over to the UK, the one thing they'd want in that kind of environment is to live near other people who look like them, which is why it was happening and why streets were rapidly changing demographically.
Yeah, and it's funny in a way thinking about Malcolm X as the choice for the Indian Workers Association, whom Jouhl represented when he invited Malcolm X to come along. You know, Malcolm X was very much the firebrand alternative to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was saying, let's do this in a peaceful way. Malcolm X was saying, let's not do this in a peaceful way. We need to resist, and violently so. But the Indian Workers Association, they were really deeply engaged in efforts to counter racial discrimination in places like Smethwick through gentler means generally. For example, the Indian Workers Association wrote directly to Marshall Street residents, like letters. They put them through their letterboxes, basically saying, let's not let social issues be exploited for racist ends, and let's try not to let these politicians divide us. And that approach was part of this broader strategy of engagement and using reasoned appeals and community dialogue alongside public protest in a bid to build their own view of how society could and should be. And so in a way, getting Malcolm X in at this juncture was, I think, partly because he was just in the country. As Rebecca said, he had been rejected from France. They didn't let him in. And so here he was, he'd been giving some speeches in London, and they were like, well, he's a good guy to get to come and see what we are dealing with. And actually, I'd say Malcolm X's take, even though he did make sort of Nazi comparisons, not unfairly, with the stuff that he had seen, I think he was fairly gentle as far as Malcolm X goes in his reaction to the place that he was looking at.
I mean, well, this is a really interesting point in Malcolm X's life as well, and it can't help but give rise to the question of, you know, what if he hadn't been assassinated 9 days later? Because he had really shifted his earlier perspective quite significantly by this point. He had left the Nation of Islam and he had travelled to Mecca, he travelled to various countries in Africa, and had really changed his focus, which had been very specifically on the African-American struggle in the USA. He became interested in the Pan-African movement. He became interested in broader solidarity against racism and creating that solidarity between different non-white groups. And it's interesting when you look at the racist material that was being put out around this time, around the Smethwick election and then afterwards, that black and Indian are used interchangeably. In fact, actually, even some of the anti-racism activists are using the term black to refer to not only to Caribbean immigrants, but to the immigrants from India as well. So there was this consciousness that they were all fighting part of the same fight. And that's part of what the Indian Workers Association was doing too. It was challenging racial discrimination, which didn't just affect Indians. Also, you know, there was a large Jamaican population. And there were workplaces in and around Smethwick where it was common for non-white workers to be paid less and to be made to use separate facilities like toilets and break rooms, and for black and Asian customers to be turned away, as you mentioned, in pubs and in shops. And so this was the point in Malcolm X's life where he could really embrace that viewpoint and embrace that kind of wider solidarity. And in fact, when he was talking to the reporters who'd obviously followed him there, he said, I was in Birmingham, Alabama the other day. This will give me a chance to see if Birmingham, England is any different. And there was a really interesting comparison I found too. A month after the election, a group led by what the Birmingham Post called 12 Angry Housewives petitioned the council to buy up the vacant homes in Marshall Street and ensure they were only rented out to white tenants because they didn't want private landlords renting them out to non-white people. But one of those activists, who was a mother and a school cook called Alice Groves, she made the link with the US situation explicit. She said Marshall Street was becoming, quote, the Smethwick Harlem. So there really was this strange kind of synchronicity between the two situations. Even on the surface, they seem so different.
Yeah, and that plan to make Marshall Street only available to white residents was in the end nixed by the housing ministry because, as you said earlier, we had a Labour government at this point, so they were never going to actually allow Smethwick to do that. But you're in this kind of moment in time, as you say, it's fascinating in Malcolm X's timeline. You're also in this fascinating moment of time in race relations in the UK, because at this point, you're just a few weeks before the 1965 Race Relations Act comes in. When that comes in, it finally bans discrimination in public places. So you can't have segregated pubs anymore, officially or unofficially. It made the promotion of hatred on the grounds of colour, race, or ethnic or national origins an offence. But still, there were 3 years before discrimination in employment and housing was also made illegal. But there was this moment, really, where it's like a pivotal moment where it really could go in either direction for the people of Smethwick. And in walks this iconic figure. It was just a sort of extraordinary moment, especially in the Blue Gates pub. They didn't serve Malcolm X. Like, he went into the bit you're not allowed to be served in as what they would have said as a coloured person, and he was refused service. He had to go and stand in the other bit of the bar. And that's, I mean, for the people running the bar, the fact that they're denying service to Malcolm X, who then makes this comparison, not only with the African-American struggle, but with the Jews under Hitler. He says, I would not wait for the fascist elements in Smethwick to erect gas ovens. How must that have felt for the locals in the pub, you know?
It's bold, isn't it? I mean, you'd think that you might be tempted to make an exception when one of the most famous men on the planet walks in. I mean, you know, Peter Griffiths himself lost his Smethwick seat in the 1966 snap general election that basically saw this very decisive landslide go in Labour's direction, and that swing proved fatal for Griffiths. And you can't help but feel also the stuff that had gone on in the short time that he had been overseeing this town, including the visit of Malcolm X. This was the moment where things were really turning in the other direction. And you can't help but feel that Peter Griffiths would be turning in his grave if he, like me, had checked TripAdvisor. Not like me, my reaction to this was very different, but I checked TripAdvisor to find out what the number one thing to do today in Smethwick is. And the top-rated thing to do in Smethwick is to take a visit to Guru Nanak Gurdwara of Smethwick, which is the first and largest Sikh place of worship in the United Kingdom.
It's still not quite fulfilling the promise of Smethwick Harlem, is it?
I think that's the first and only time that Smethwick's ever been compared to Harlem.
Tomorrow.
It doesn't matter how good or bad our athletes are, we just have to get someone to be sitting in a bobsled.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.